Greetings and welcome once again everyone to another lesson, and what we will be discussing today is the number concept, and specifically writing out numbers as words. So when we think about this, there are very important rules that we have to use, and yes, I will just share with us the rules that we basically use. So basically, when we have to write out numbers, we have to work from left to right. So often your number, of course, of the highest value will always be on your most left-hand side. Then when you are expressing, whether you are saying it or you are writing it out, you'd always firstly state the number with the highest value, and then you'd work towards your right, approaching numbers of decreasing value. So when we think about a number, for example, 5, let me just write out this number, maybe this kind of number. Whenever you actually say this number, you'd always start from your leftmost side, and then you'd work towards your right. So you'd say 5,864,271. Should always work from left to right, because of course this column would be the millions, and then this column would be the units. Should obviously say the one with the highest value first, and then work towards your right. I hope that makes sense. Then in addition to that, another important rule that we have to remember is that every number must be expressed in words. So at no point can you actually use digits when you are expressing your actual number. They must all be in words, right? Then thirdly, if ever you find yourself with numbers ranging from 21 to 99, you always have to hyphenate these numbers. So what does it really mean? If I have the number 21, sorry, let's use a different color. If I have the number 21, 99, 32, 44, then whenever I have to write out these numbers, I'd write them as follows: 21, 99, 32, 44. We can even add a much higher number. You can even think about 88. Think about 88. Yes. Then when we think about this, we see that any number between 21 to 99, we have to hyphenate. And this is what is known as hyphenating. That's also really, really important. So another important rule is that at certain points, we will also use an expression called "and", usually used for numbers that are usually used between numbers within certain columns, but this I will express or show us an example of how exactly to use and. So let's look at our very first number. And let's go back to the previous number we thought about. So when we actually think about this number, and we have to break it up, just as we learned in our previous video, we of course already know that this is in the millions column, this is in your hundreds of thousands column, this is your tens of thousands column, this is your thousands column, this is your hundreds column, your tens column, and your units. So if you had to express this in words, you'd express it as 5 million, comma. You know that the 8 is 100,000. So 8, even though you want to say 800,000, you of course know that this 64 is also, this 6 and 4 also form part of thousands, right? So it's say 800, and then you have 64, to express that as 64. Why are you hyphenating? Because it's resembling some sort of number between 21 and 99 in terms of its digits, right? And 64, and that's when you'd add the 1,000. So basically this 1,000 is common to 4, 6, and 8. Because even though 8 is 800,000, this 6 is 60,000, and this 4 is 4,000, because they all share 1,000, then that's why we write it last, and that's why we express it 864,000. If you think about it, it would be incorrect to say 5,800,000, 60,000, and 4,000, because all of them share this 1,000. Then you would say 864,000. I hope that makes sense. When we think about the comma that is being used here, the comma is being used because we are transitioning from millions to hundreds of thousands, right? And then you'd add a comma here when we transition from 1,000 to hundreds, and there is no zero. That's really important. All of these values are digits greater than 0. So that's why we add another comma here, and then we would say 200. Why is it 100? Because this 2 is being represented by the 100 column, right? And then as we saw, any digits between 21 and 99, we express and 71. And of course we hyphenate. Yes. So that's really, really important, right? So whenever you have values that are within this hundreds to within these hundreds, tens, and units, you would always use the and, right? Provided that there are no zeros. So then let's look at another example. And let's think about the case where we have the number 5,008,000. How would we write this? So now we can see we replace the 6 with a 0. And zeros are not actually shared or stated when you are writing out the number. The zeros are just placeholders to show you the position of a digit, so that we know which column it forms part of, so that when we are expressing it in words, we are expressing that specific digit according to its correct place value. I hope that's making sense. So when we look at it like this, then once again, we know, right? 5 is a million, 8 is 100,000, the 0 would form part of the tens of thousands, this 4 is part of the thousands, this 2 is part of 100, this 7 is part of the tens, and this 1 is part of the units. Had this 0 not been written, then this number would look like this. And if there's no 0, so this is if no 0 was written between the 8 and the 4, then what would you have considered this number to be? Then you'd assume that this is the unit, this is the 10, this is the 100, this is the 1,000, this is the tens of thousands, and this is the hundreds of thousands. Then you could have thought that this was 584,271. So that's why it's so important to place the 0 there, because if there's no 0 there, then of course you will get your place values confused. So even though you don't say the 0, the purpose of the 0 is to show you the place value of each digit so that we know whether it's part of millions, 100,000, 10,000s correctly. So if you had to write this out, you'd write it as 5 million, comma, 800, then once again, and, right, 4,000, comma, 200, and 71. Now going back, we know that this 5 is part of the millions. We know that this 8 is a part of your hundreds of thousands. But because this 4 is also part of the thousands, we don't just say 800,000 and 4,000, we say 804,000 because they both share the 1,000. Then once again, we know we use the comma because there's a transition from millions to hundreds of thousands, where those are actual digits that are not 0. And we also know that we add another comma here because we are transitioning from thousands to hundreds, and none of these values are 0, but they are actual digits greater than 0. Then of course we hyphenate here because this 71 is within 21 and 99. Yes. Then of course we use and here because whenever we are between 100 and units and there are no zeros, we use and. So let's think about another number, and let's think about the case where we just had 5. How would we express this? Then in the same way, you would just express this as 5 million, comma, 800,000, then 271. That's of course how you would express that, right? Because once again, this is millions, this is hundreds of thousands, this is tens of thousands, hundreds, tens, units. Then of course this million has to be represented there. I'm using a comma because I am because I am transitioning from millions to hundreds of thousands. I'm using the 800,000 because these zeros are just showing the place value of 8. We know 8 belongs to the hundreds of thousands column, so I express it as 800,000. I put a comma here because I'm transitioning from thousands to hundreds, and then I state the 200 because the 2 is part of the hundreds column, and then I write 71 hyphenated because 71 is between 21 and 99, right? So then when we think about another example, and let's pretend we have this case. Let's say we have 5 million. So in this case, we go through the same process that we always follow through. This is a million, this is 100,000, this is in tens thousands, this is in thousands, this is in hundreds, this is in tens, and this is in units. So if I had to express this, I'd express it as 5 million, 800,000 and 71. So let's go back and see how we got this number. So we know the 5 million is always, the 5 is part of the millions column, so we put million down. We put the comma there because I'm transitioning from millions to 100,000s, and both of them are actual digits that are greater than 0, right? Then I know I don't have any specific digits greater than 0 here, so I can just share 800,000 as 800,000. However, when I transition from thousands to hundreds, both of these, as I'm transitioning from hundreds and thousands, both of them are 0, so there's no need to put a comma as we shared, but we put and, right? And that's where we get the and then because this is 71, it's of course hyphenated. Let's always remember, whenever we transition from millions to hundreds of thousands and from thousands to hundreds, if they are both 0, then there's no need to put a comma. If one of them is a 0, then there's also no need to put a comma, but you would put and, right? So let's see it again. And let's think about if we have to write this number like this. Then try and pause the video and see whether you are getting the same sort of like items to see if it is actually making sense to you as well. Then we go back to what we always do, right? This is part of millions, this is part of hundreds of thousands, this is tens of thousands, this is thousands, this is hundreds, this is tens, and that's units. Then if I have to express this, I express this as 5 million and 71, right? Why are we phrasing it like this? I know 5 is part of the millions column, and that's why I write it like that. I know these zeros are just placeholders, right? And I know when I transition from millions to hundreds of thousands and one of them is a 0, there's no need to use a comma. I also know when I'm transitioning from thousands to hundreds and both of them are 0, there's no need to use a comma. However, because the millions and the tens and the units are obviously separate columns, I use and. to link the two columns together. And then, of course, because 71 is between 21 and 99, I hyphenate. I'm hoping that makes sense to everyone. So let's try our very last example. And let's say we have the number, let's say we have the number let's say we have this number. Then how would we actually write this number out in words? Then once again, you'd go back, right? You'd go back to actually labeling them, right? So this is in the millions, this is in the tens of thousands, this is not in the tens of thousands. This is in the hundreds of thousands, this is in the tens of thousands, this is in thousands, this is in the hundreds, this is in the tens, and that's the units. Then when I express that, I'd write it as 5 million, comma, right? 800 800,000 and 1. Then let's go back and see why. I know the 5 is in the millions column. I know 8 is a part of the hundreds of thousands column. These are both 0. They are placeholders, so I can just write out 800,000 as I would. But then as I transition from thousands to hundreds of thousands, I see that both values are 0. Therefore, I use an and then of course I reflect that this one is of course here. Then once again, if I had to express the number as 5 in this way, then once again, so the reason I am showing this in this detail is to show us that this is actually not very difficult. It just follows a similar pattern, right? And this would just be 5 million and 1. Why? Because the 5 is part of the million column. When I transition from here to here, one of the values is a 0. There's no need for a comma. When I transition from millions to 100,000, when I transition from thousands to hundreds, they both 0, no need for a comma. And therefore, I need to use and to link the two columns together. Of course, I just write 1 as I normally would. So that's really important. So the very, very last example I will give to us is if you have this case. If you have this case, how would you express it? Then you'd express that as 5 million 4,000 271. then always remember it always follows the same sort of format, right? This would form part of your millions. Then as you transition from here to there, you see that there's actually some value here between the millions and the thousands, and that's why you would use the comma, because it's not all zeros. And then of course you would say use the 4,000 here, and then as you transition from the thousands to the hundreds, you'd of course use a comma, and then you would have 200, right, that we saw because the 2 is part of the hundreds column, and 71, which is hyphenated because of this case. Then for our very, very last case, what if we had this? So regardless of whether these values in the digits change, the system and the way of writing always remains the same. What I'm trying to show everyone is to see how you can think about them according to where it is placed, and how you can know whether to use a comma or whether to use and as well. Okay. So when you look at something like this, how would you express it? 5 million, comma, 4,000, and 71. Then you go back. This is millions because of the millions. I'm using a comma here because I'm transitioning from millions to 1,000. There's 2,000s. There's actually values there, so I put the comma there. I know the 4 is part of the thousands column, so I put thousands there. I know there's no hundreds being represented because of the 0 that's there. And then of course I have a value between 21 and 99. And of course I'd write it as 71 and hyphenate. So that's really, really important. There's no comma between the 4 and the 0 as I transition from thousands to hundreds, because one of them has a 0, and because of that no comma is used, but and is specifically used to check that. Then yes, I hope our time of finding out how exactly to write numbers into actual words was really helpful. Please do type in the chat box if you have any further questions. And yes, see you in the next video.